Okay, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Georgia Antonopoulos. I am the Executive Director of Thrive, the Alliance of Nonprofits for San Mateo County. And on behalf of Thrive and the Sobrato Family Foundation, I wanted to welcome you all to our event today called Toxic Inequality, Difficult Conversations Toward Greater Equity and Inclusion. And just to give you some context, so this is a joint program, and it's a community forum and a Sobrato speaker series. And it's very synergistic that we are coming together. The goal of the Sobrato speaker series is exploring tools and strategies to strengthen Silicon Valley organizations to best address our region's complex challenges. Our Thrive community forums, which meet quarterly, feature the most pressing challenges and the most creative solutions from our own membership community. So it really makes sense that we're bringing our membership community together today here to discuss this challenge. On that note, I wanted to give an extra special welcome to our Thrive membership in the room today, all our current Thrive members and our future Thrive members. So I wanted to walk you through the format for this morning. First, we will have a presentation of findings. Then we will have a discussion with our panelists, and finally we will have time for question and answers. Before we get into that, I'd love for all of you to take out your phones for a minute, and we're going to do Sobrato's famous polls to start off our program. So to join the poll, just text Sobrato Foundation, Sobrato FDN, to 22333 to join the conversation. So we're going to wait a moment for everyone to do that. All right, so is everyone on? No. Okay, great. No, we're still waiting. Okay, we'll give it another few minutes, few seconds. You have to text Sobrato FDN to 22333. Raise your hand if you've been able to join the conversation. So you have to, in the number, you do 22333, and then you text the words Sobrato FDN. Okay, one more time. Raise your hand if you've actually been able to get on. Okay, I think we have a good group, so we're going to move forward. So the first question is really trying to get a sense of who is in the room today. So what are your organization's primary activities? Are they direct services, policy and advocacy, movement, network building, technical assistance, grant making, or are you a public sector organization? So in real time, we are getting a sense of who is in the room today. Okay, great. Looks like we have 55% direct services, about 18% grant making, and then we have some movement, network building, policy advocacy, and 7% public sector. So that's who's in the room today. It's a really nice mix of people. So this is an open-ended question, so you're going to be typing your responses. So what inspired you to attend this session, and/or what are you hoping to learn today? With the caveat that we will probably not get to everything today, but we wanted to get a sense of what is in the room. So we will give you a minute for this. I would love to see your answers. So we've got latest research data and equity, recommendation of the book, the topic, FC, inspired by topic, lifelong commitment to these issues, how to have these conversations, how we gain more control, to meet the panelists, inequality, a new perspective. Great. Well, thank you for those. I think you will not be disappointed by today's discussion and panel. And I'd like to now ask our friend Rick Williams, the CEO of the Sobrato Family Foundation, to come up as he will be leading us into today's presentation, panel, and discussion.
Thank you, Georgia. All right. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Definitely start off by thanking everyone for being here. We came across this work and we came across Tom's book and thought instantly, what a great opportunity to get people together, but you never know that this is a topic that people are interested in. So we were blown away when we thought there were going to be like 20 people here, and we have over 100, so we're thrilled. Thank you very much. So Georgia, I want to thank you for co-hosting this with us. Really appreciate it. So, as each of you know, the struggle to make ends meet in Silicon Valley is getting harder and harder for the families that we care about. Each of our organizations are working tirelessly using different strategies to find ways to help people find financial security. And I'm not talking about financial wealth. I'm not talking about five-star hotels. I'm talking about just financial security. That type of security that families need so that they don't have to worry about a car breaking down. Financial security so they don't have to worry about plumbing breaking in their apartment or shared housing. That financial security so that they don't have to worry about a family member getting sick. That's what we're talking about. How do we get that type of financial security? We wanted to hold this conversation because in our minds, we spend a lot of time talking about the strategies and the work we're doing that focuses on our efforts to deal with the results of inequality, the results of the achievement and opportunity gap. But collectively, I think we all do it individually, but collectively, we haven't spent enough time together talking about the underlying issues, the issues of inequality. What's causing the gaps? What's causing people to be working as hard as they can, following the rules, and still not getting ahead? So Tom's book, and I should call him Dr. Shapiro, but we've known him so long, I probably can't do that, and he'd probably hit me if I did do that, gave us a perfect vehicle to stop, take a step back, and look at what we're doing and how our strategies may or may not be effective if we don't focus on those underlying issues. What we're hoping to do today is open our minds. We're hoping to have the opportunity in a large group, which is also more challenging, to have a civil conversation about race, about institutional racism and policies that have perpetuated inequality in this country. And we want to have it in a way that when you leave here, you're in a better position to think about our work differently. There's a lot of work for all of us to do collectively. There's a lot of work for us to do individually. But it starts by us being, first of all, willing to step back and look at what we're doing. And I say that from my own personal, as a personal example. When we were putting this event together, I was coming up with questions for the speakers and looking at, and I read Tom's book and was just enamored by some of the points you'll hear us talk about later. I got through the questions and we were having our call with the panel, and in nowhere in the questions that I came up with after reading the book, after hearing what the book is about, after focusing on the basic tenet of the book, did I have a question on race. myself, I didn't have one. And so I think that goes to the core. We don't talk about it. And we're going to try to do that in a very open way. But more so, through the work that Tom has provided, we're going to be able to look at how families over 2 decades, that's what I think is the most intriguing part of the book that Tom wrote. He had the opportunity to spend 2 decades with these families and look at their heroic efforts to follow the rules and get things done. And still with that, they were not able to overcome the challenges and the obstacles and the regulations and policies in their life, mostly because most of the time they didn't know that those existed. And they didn't know that they were up against something. So what are our families and individuals up against that we may not know about and that they definitely don't know about? That's what we're trying to start a conversation. We will not end that conversation today, clearly, but we're hoping to start that. Tom's book highlights the institutional and systemic policies and practices that impact families over their life course, that impacts their ability to pass down intergenerational wealth, that impacts their ability to give their kids a helping hand. A lot of you this weekend, I know I talked to 2 or 3 of you. How many had a graduation this weekend or the last couple of weeks? If you're like me, you sat out in the hot sun, I apologize. I just got back last night. How many kids are never going to get there? So our kids could get there. So other issue that we need to look at is how do we fit in this? How do we fit in this? And how do you maintain rootedness in a community as you continue to advance in your careers and advance in your places? So a lot of that conversation we're gonna have. We're going to talk about, we're just going to scratch the surface, which feels really bad between now and 11:45. But I wanted to tee it up in a way that I thought you understand what our intent is. And if people feel really good about this, we'll definitely do something do this again. So with that, let me introduce my dear friend, Tom. Tom and I have had the pleasure of traveling all over this country, working on financial inequality, for, I don't want to say how many years, but we had a blast doing it. There were a lot of cards and drinking and good meals along the way as we told stories about what we saw and the challenges we faced and how we got so close to certain things and didn't kind of push them through but kept going. And so he's been a soldier in this field forever. He's been one of the primary thought leaders in this space. If you have not read the Sentinel book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, that came out in 1995, I urge you to do it. They've updated it, and it's still just as fresh, and it's still just as relevant today. And that serves as a foundation for toxic inequality, which I think we now have a new label when we talk about the institutional and systemic issues that are affecting our families. Tom has given us the gift of having something to call it. So, Tom, born in LA, now lives in Boston, and a pleasure to call him my dear friend. So we'll let him kick it off. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Rick, thank you so much, and for everybody that's helped to put this on. Good morning, everybody, and happy Juneteenth Day. And if you don't know what that is, we'll get to it later. I want to tell a story about 2 families that I had the honor of talking to over a long period of time. And I want to boil this one story down because I think it really taps into a lot of the themes, a lot of the institutional mechanisms and policy mechanisms of discrimination that provide advantages for some and pretty severe challenges and disadvantages for others. So I'm going to talk about Tina Medina and Peter Ackerman. Going back to 1998, when we first talked to their families, Peter and Tina were 5-year-olds, so we really didn't interview them. But they were prime youngsters of interest to us. I want to tell you a little bit about their families. David and Allison Ackerman, at that point, both worked at a large organization. And they were earning a pretty solid middle-class income It was about $82,000 or $83,000 back in 1998, and had them situated pretty well. They had bought a home in a community outside of St. Louis. If anybody's from St. Louis, it's called Afton. It was a relatively recent suburban development. They had bought a home. They were living there, raising their children, liking the school district, watching their home increase in value and create wealth for themselves. At their jobs at this large organization had a pretty robust set of benefits associated with the job, including a nice health care coverage for both of them, including a mandatory retirement savings plan, where 5% of their paychecks were involuntarily taken from them, and then their large organizations matched it with another 5 or another 10%. And they had been working there for a while, and this was building up for them. Allison worked essentially as a bookkeeper. David worked in public safety, basically running the communications from squad car to central, and alerting each other to what was going on within their organization and the facilities there. The Medina family, their story is somewhat similar, but also hits some very profound points of differences. Both India and Elijah Medina worked at what I would consider roughly equivalent occupations to what the Ackermans did. But they had been working at a series of organizations, typically small businesses, that did not provide employer-based benefits like retirement plan, a savings plan, not much, if any, healthcare coverage, no paid sick leave, all the kinds of things that we tend to talk about. So when we first talked to those families, and they owned a home in a part of St. Louis called Spanish Lake. I don't know if people know the geography of St. Louis. It's right close to where the Lewis and Clark expedition actually took off for the West. It was a small house, a workman's cottage, if you will. 1998, the Medina family had basically no financial wealth. They had their home, and they had their children, which they were sending to school, including Tina. Now, it's not incidental at all to this story that the Medina family is African American and the Ackerman family is white. Roughly similar occupations. They're very different stories in terms of the robust benefits that each of them have, so that one family by 1998 is starting to accumulate financial wealth, whereas the Medinas are not. They're both putting in, I would argue, the same effort. In fact, if we were just measuring hours at work, the Medina family, Elijah in particular, starts to hold 2 and 3 jobs, even has a side business of repairing antique cars and selling them. We catch up with them in 2010 and 2011, where both of the children, Peter and Tina, now are of college age or about to be of college age. And here we start to see some very profound differences. And there are a lot of ways of telling this story. But let me tell you the story from a policy and a structural and an institutional point of view. Peter Medina is at the University of Missouri. And in fact, the Ackermans, he's got a younger sister that's also about to go to college. Tina Medina has dropped out of high school. And she's working in the service sector. She's working at a local hotel behind the desk. There are not very many benefits associated with what she's doing. Her salary's not all that great, but it seems like a steady job. But college may not be in her future. When we talked to both families back in 1998, both families had similarly high aspirations for higher education for their children. Right? Peter Ackerman, part of the benefits of his family's organization they worked for was that organization paid for his college education. So when I actually went back and tried to do a calculation of what that second paycheck, that's what HR would call it, the second paycheck, the benefits that you don't see, what that amounted to the Ackerman family, in the year that we interviewed them, it was $33,500 in addition to their paycheck. That's $33,500 added to their retirement savings, the college tuition they didn't have to pay, and coverage on their health care. The exact kind of benefits that Tina Medina and family did not have. All right. One family, the Ackermans, had a very deep and robust structure of support to make the aspiration of higher education, to have there be no gap between that aspiration and the concrete reality. And yes, of course, there's a lot of agency for Peter and his family. This is not predetermined. But if we also look and examine Tina Medina's story, there was a huge gap between the aspirations she and the family had when she was very young and what higher education she actually could afford. I don't know why. I can't look into her head and really know whether that's why she dropped out and whether she's ever going to get back. But we can stand today and think about how economic mobility, how the opportunity for college education is color-coded by race in this instance, having very deep and profound implications, I think, for institutional structures and policy. Right. Now, normally, how's this story told? All right, now I'm going to be a little crass, and we can turn the microphones and the Twitter off for a little bit, because I'm going to use a little language. Not really. But this story is usually told, well, Peter and his family valued education, and he worked hard. And he got to the University of Missouri. And he's going to walk into probably, I'm going to suggest, a pretty decent middle-class job without student debt. Tina Medina, coming from that African-American family that does not value education, that doesn't work hard, that's lazy, that spends its money on sneakers and stereos and conspicuous consumption, she's not going to get to college. And that's a story that tells us the problem is with the behavior of the vulnerable family. Where when I look at it, and you get under all of the dirt and the cover and the practices going on, it's a very different story to narrate. And that's part of the challenge, I know, that we as service deliverers, as policy advocates, as movement builders face. How to tell that story in a way that we think resonates with what actually is going on. All right, so let me back end this story in particular. And I want to talk just a little bit about inheritance and then actually hit a couple of data points before we can open it up for some larger conversation. I don't know what the Ackerman family is going to do with its $350,000 of wealth that they had when we talked to them. I know what the Medina family is not able to do with about the $5,000 of wealth that they have. And it is not so incidental that during the foreclosure crisis, 2007 to 2009 or so, depending upon where you are in the country, where the Ackermans lived in the Afton suburb, their property values plummeted, like most areas in the country, but it came back relatively quickly, so that today the home is actually worth more on paper than it was before the foreclosure crisis. The Medina's home in Spanish Lake is a very different story. Their community flipped. Their community flipped from homeowners to absentee landlords. There were a number of foreclosures, and a number of those foreclosures were bought up by an investment firm that turned around, rented them out, and so now there's a series of absentee landlords. At our last point of contact with the Medina family, they were very discouraged about what was happening in their neighborhood. They moved there because they were seeing professionals, a relatively diverse community, and now they were seeing the community, as I remember Elijah putting it, there were a lot of Section 8 people in there. There was a lot of subsidies for renters in there. And in their mind, that was part of what was changing the community. The Ackermans are in a position to help Peter and other members of their family achieve their dreams, to protect them if the heating or the plumbing system breaks down in their homes, and to use their wealth to buy opportunities in the future for themselves and their families. And they're like some other American families. One just quick data point. Looking at, from a longitudinal study of families over a long period of time, that is the same set of families, between 1984 and 2013, about a third, little over a third, of all American families transmitted $10,000 or more to other family members. All right, so at a relatively, I don't know what you think 10,000 is, large or small or adequate, about a third of American families inherit over that period of time. But that too, not surprisingly, is color-coded. 46% of white families inherit 10,000 or more, 10% of African-American families. All right. Wealth is transmitted between generations, provides opportunities, advantages, and severe challenges for those that don't have it. All right. In addition to that 46-to-10 ratio, when blacks inherit, of that 10% that do inherit, they inherit $30,000 less on average than whites who inherit. Okay. And that helps produce a racial wealth gap in the United States. And I only want to show 2 slides because I think both of them, if I want anybody to take any numbers or any visual sense of what's going on, it's in this slide and really in the next one as well. A cross-section, looking at one point in time, 2013, the median wealth at the 50th percentile, so half above, half below. A white family's average wealth at that level is $142,000. African-American family wealth is $11,000, and Hispanic family wealth is $13,700. Okay. A better way to put that, if we're narrating it and framing it, not a better way, a different way, is that typical average African-American family has about 8 cents in wealth for every dollar of wealth that typical white family has. And the Latino family has less than a dime in wealth for every dollar of wealth that the white family has. Right. Now, as a sociologist, as somebody very concerned about inequality and equity in American society, 2 questions arise. One is, oh my gosh, how do we find ourselves in a starting point where we're talking about 8 cents on a dollar or a dime on a dollar? You know, what's in our history? What's going on? What produces that? What drives that? And second, how do we think about parity? How do we think about closing that in a very fundamental, transformative way? Now, the data I gave, I flipped aside too. Don't look. Shut your eyes. I don't know if I can go back. Or I can go back. All right. So always give away the answer before posing the question. That's what lawyers do. No. The data I gave, the 8 cents and a dime on a dollar, is from what we call a cross-sectional study. It's from a good national random sample of American families at one point in time. Another question to ask, and I would suggest equally important, if not more so, is to pose a question: what happens over a period of time with the exact same families? And I'm going to give you data, because you've not looked yet, that goes from 1984 to 2013. 1984, it's not a trick year. It's simply the year the survey, and it was the first one to do this, asked families about their financial assets and debts. So that's the only time there. Okay, I think we've got some time coming up. To pose the question, what if in the mid-1960s, because of really successful civil rights legislation around home ownership, around financing, around public ownership, around business, around access to higher education, America really was inching towards that, what some call the post-racial society. If that were the case, whatever the racial wealth gap was in 1984, no matter how bad it was, should have stayed on an even keel and marched itself through time. The data tell us a very different story. What the data tell us is that in 1984, that gap in inflation-adjusted dollars opens up at $84,000, and by 2013 has tripled to $245,000. So not just a difference in starting point, our legacy, our history, but we also have to focus in terms of racial equity, in terms of justice, in terms of opportunity, about contemporary policy, what's going on in our communities, our schools, racial residential segregation that helps to value how homes increase or don't increase, a whole lot of dots to connect here. And so I would suggest we start connecting some of those dots. And I think Rick and I are going to enter in a conversation about it. But I do want to fulfill the one tease I opened with. Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth Day. 152 years ago, one president issued an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. That, for reasons historians debate, never was announced in what we call the state of Texas today. And today is the day that 152 years ago, a proclamation that was pronounced 150 years ago, 2.5 years after it was proclaimed, a Union general, and I hope that's not a lesson, a Union general implements it in Texas. And for the first time, helps people in Texas think about transforming systems. Slaves can become free laborers overnight, and all that entailed, and all the challenges and the legacy that left us with. So systems can change, even when we think it's impossible. So Rick.
So I didn't, I overlooked the fact that we are going to have a Q&A afterwards. I'm going to talk real briefly with Tom for the next, I don't know, 15 or so minutes, or until you guys get tired of us. And then we're going to invite, we have Avani Patel from the Peery Foundation here, and we have McDonnell from the United Way Bay Area here, and they're going to join us, and we're going to take what Tom's talking about on a national level and bring it down to a local level to get a sense and have a real conversation about what's happening here in the Valley. So that's what's going to happen after we have this quick Q&A. So thank you.
Great.
So thank you for being here. So let's start, and I know there's some questions out there, but your conversation brought up a bunch of other questions. I'm going to try not to ask them, because I'll stick to some of these.
I know, I went off script already.
Went off script, which is great, But let's start with the basic one that we don't get to talk about enough. How do you explain the disconnect between the perception of equity and mobility and its accessibility to all Americans and the reality that that just isn't the case, and that America is actually down way far in the pack in terms of developed countries?
Yeah, so I wish we really had the answer to that fully, and I wish that a lot more people understood it. We can start with denial is more than a river in Egypt. We have our own river that's very wide in the United States, wider than the Mississippi. Here's where I really break into that as a sociologist and somebody who's tried to work in this area for a long time. The United States has changed, and we've changed a lot since we first started this work and from the civil rights movement on. And I would suggest that most of the change, in addition to successful civil rights legislation, most of the change is in people's individual and personal attitudes. And it is, we can measure it in the number of intermarriages and the number of diverse friends. Some communities are a little more inclusive. And on a personal level, people know the other, or some others of the other. Right. And that, I think, leads us to a misguided understanding that the level of racism, the level of injustice has vastly decreased in the United States, because it doesn't, while it still exists at the personal level, and maybe we can back into that a little bit, but it's really profoundly embedded in our institutions, our policies, and our structures. And I would maybe let me just give one quick historical example. The most robust leg of retirement security is Social Security. Passed in the mid 1930s, 1934, implemented about 1935 or so. Almost everybody's covered today. When Social Security was introduced, there were occupations that were specifically outlined in the legislation to be excluded. And those were domestic workers, agricultural workers, and railroad workers for another set of reasons. Right? Not coincidentally, in fact, historians think very intentionally designed to exclude who worked in those occupations: African Americans and Hispanic workers, domestic workers, agricultural workers. So we built this great so-called, air quote, universal system that benefited everybody, right? Where the fact of the matter was that it did not. It intentionally excluded entire swaths of the population. And it's not until later in the 1960s where other occupations, specifically farm workers, through Cesar Chavez and others, as part of the social movement, bring other occupations in. And so now most occupations are covered. But there's still the legacy of that. Who wasn't able to get Social Security? Who wasn't able to get SSI, disability? Who wasn't able to take part in other parts of the program? So about 70% of Social Security funds go to retirement savings and help folks. The other 30% is for disability, SSI, helping the children of workers who are disabled get to college. Right? That entire, I would suggest, 2 generations of Hispanics and African Americans, by our policy, by our structures, are kept back. The other way to put it, because what's challenging, I think, sometimes for audiences like us, is that advantage and disadvantage are 2 sides of the same coin. When you're disadvantaging Hispanics and African Americans, you are also advantaging whites by providing those.
No, that's actually good. And I guess before I ask the next question, this is a conversation about values that we're trying to have. It's not a political conversation at all. It's what are the values we want to carry forward as a nation? That's what we're trying to have a conversation about. One of the interesting things in the book, Tom, you talk about is how segregated neighborhoods harden their advantages and disadvantages for the people that live there. Can you say more about those for people that haven't read the book? I found that fascinating.
So this is hard. It's tough because we don't usually think about it. And we can start and end with, and Tom's air quote, public schools. I don't know what California really looks like in terms of quality of school districts and test scores and stuff. I can tell you the data from Massachusetts. But I would guess that if we were to draw a list of the top 25 public schools in the state of California with the highest, whatever metric you want to use, they're all mixed up in some way, whether it's test scores or college entrance, percent of kids that go to college. If you were to draw up that 25 list and say, well, as somebody who is earning $30,000 a year, I just want to send my kid to one of those 25 schools. Right? People are laughing. Right? We know that it's probably the case that you need to be a homeowner in one of those 25 communities, and it's certainly the case, I would suggest, I don't know the California data, so a caveat, it's most likely the case that you're not going to be able to afford it. And there are very little rental opportunities in those kinds of communities. So there's resource hoarding going on there. Right? And that's not necessarily to say that a youngster can't thrive in a less resource system. It's just that if everything else were equal, I and you, we want our kids in the school system that's got the most robust set of resources. And then let's individual talent work itself out. Right? But that's not the case. And so in the book, I talk about the case of Orinda, California, where the school district literally hired a private detective and spent money to probe the eligibility of a young Latina to go to its public schools, where they had written down the address within that community because the mother worked as a domestic, live-in domestic at a home in that community. And she was, the young Latina was tossed out. She was tossed out. And it was just, it took a little bit of outrage for the school district to reverse its decision. But that's the kind of structured and institutional setup, and sometimes the protection of it, the lengths to which some communities will go, whether it's through zoning, hello, whether it's through access to water, whether it's through who can go to your schools. Some communities will try to protect those resources because it provides advantages for their kids. It gives them a competitive advantage. Okay.
So what did you, the people doing this aren't evil or bad. So what did you learn?
Right.
What's the, is it they're just following on the institutions and the practices that exist? What's your takeaway from the 3 decades you
Yeah,
spent?
so this is, for me, it's really, there are many difficult conversations, and this is one for me that really hits its structure. So in the instances I just talked about, with access to public schools, moving to a community that's got a better school system, if you can afford it. Right? Not the dirty secret. The secret is that those families are in fact rewarded. They're rewarded for acting in a racialized way. I didn't say racist way. They're rewarded. There's a material incentive and reward for acting in a racialized way. Right? Because in fact, school systems are higher quality in relatively white upper middle class communities. All right? And so if you think about it in that way, we're providing, our structures and policy provide those incentives. Now, yes, I am not excusing or excluding the arena of active discrimination, of active racism. We see it in studies all the time. But the two things I think operate in tandem, and from the perch where I sit, I think that where the focus is not at all is on the policy and on the structured level. To talk about where those incentives are and to think about, well, all right, at the end of the day, I really don't care where people live. I mean, I do, but I can say I don't. But I don't want a consequence of that to be further inequality. So if the advantage of moving to a relatively white upper middle class community, if that school system was like other school systems, not to bring it down, bring others up, you've taken the advantage away. And that's where, if we can uncouple that material link that induces racialized behavior, I think that's a great project. And I think the values behind that, I think everybody is going to agree with.
And you also talk about how we got there. I mean, if you go from the land grant period, all those VA loans and all those things, which are great, they were just excluded. Do you see, you're just taking the land grant as an example, do you see a modern day equivalent of that going on that we're just not aware of? Or do you see, because my concern or my fear is that we're so much in this that we may not see what's happening. And the land grant, and for people that know, you may want to take 5 seconds to talk about that. That was the biggest.
5 because I want to take 50 on the other
on the other one, because that was the biggest contributor to intergenerational wealth pass-through that has ever existed, in my opinion.
Yeah, the Homestead Act.
The Homestead Act.
The Homestead Act. Okay, that's back in the mid 1800s, just before and after the Civil War. Somebody asked me a question if you want to dig into that a little bit. This is why I showed the second slide about the racial wealth gap widening over a period of time. The contemporary analog is I would suggest that the biggest driver of the widening racial wealth gap in the United States, not the data tell me this, is home ownership. And not just the difference in rates of home ownership is about a 30% gap, literally, but it's the color-coded value of home equity depending upon the demographics of the community. All right. That gets back to the prior question. Now this audience is you're very sophisticated, so I can't do the poll here. But if we were to go outside and we were to ask people, what's the housing policy of the United States government? 95 out of 100 people will tell us it's public housing, it's rent subsidies, it's Section 8, and if you're sophisticated, it's Project Hope and all this stuff. All right? In our public discourse, in the public square, that's our understanding, most Americans' understanding of what the housing policy of the US government is. If we look at budgets, there's a very different story. The mortgage interest deduction and a couple of things around it subsidize home ownership to the tune of about $150 billion every single year. Now, it's one thing if that $150 billion were distributed somewhat equitably among people who were homeowners or wanted homes or first-time home buyers or whatever. No, 86% of that $150 billion every single year redistributes wealth actively to the top 10% of income filers. 86% of that $150 billion every single year is that what those of us, and I'll just use generic us for the moment, who fall into that category and receive the mortgage interest deduction. It's what they call a tax subsidy in the tax code. No, never use that word. It's a federal subsidy for home ownership. It's metaphorically like the federal government writes us a check, because the check we write on our taxes is not as big. Okay, I can't give you yet because it's an exciting piece of work I'm going to tease you about. We're getting to the point, the Institute I direct is getting to the point where we're going to be able to give you the race and ethnic breakdown of where that $150 billion goes. And I think that's going to be dynamite. So,
yes.
Lastly, real important for framing and narrative, and those of us that are concerned about it. The project is not to use that $150 billion and lop it off the top and close deficits. No, $150 billion is defined as the public good for housing security in the United States. We could close that door, that's the only one that's open, and with a few dissents, within 4 minutes, this room, we could redesign that, $150 billion, to reach the families we really want reached. And it's not that hard. The politics make it very difficult, okay? And I think the lack of knowledge about where that goes. And that's a campaign I'm eager to end my career on.
There you go. All right.
If I'm going to fail, I want a heroic failure.
There you go. Okay. All right, last question, then we'll bring Avani and Eric up here. As you looked in the book, you outlined and you talked about communities, and you went into details about specific communities around the country. Did you find any tipping points, anything that as we're doing our work out here, do we need to make sure that these assets exist in a certain community to make sure that they stay high opportunity neighborhoods versus low opportunity neighborhoods?
Yeah, so that it's a big struggle, and I think a huge challenge. You guys, where you're situated here and where I'm situated in Massachusetts, there are a lot of the capacity of not-for-profit organizations, I think, is very well developed, maybe overdeveloped in some areas. I think the work, and that helps, and that helps a lot. I mean, I can tell you what it looks like in Mississippi. And we'd be appalled. I can tell you what it looks like in Kansas City. You don't have to go to Mississippi. I can tell you what it looks like in St. Louis, where people are still even struggling to get direct services. Part of our challenge is to connect the dots, is to get ourselves out of the silos that the funding mechanisms and policies and our own practice has put us in. Those are some of I think the challenges that are before us in that particular area.
Let's invite, thank you, Tom. Real quick.
Thank you. Do we want move over?
I don't know, I was
put them
scared
on
of
the end?
putting them together.
Together? All right.
We'll go ahead and move over and we'll let them sit together. So
Okay.
why don't you
All
take
right.
that
Why don't
seat?
you guys sit in the middle?
We're going to let you sit
Yeah.
together.
We were advised not to do
There's a little
this.
bit of fear, but we're going to let you guys sit together in the middle. And I'll come over. Yes.
Some people are having too much fun.
Right. So great. Again, Erin McDonnell, Bay Area, 98 Bay Area, and Avani Patel from the Peery Foundation. Thank you both for agreeing to participate in this conversation. Sent out the call to them, and they did not hesitate. So that shows you the nature of their character and the type of people they are, and what they're trying to do in the community as well. I mean, they're both on the ground, staunch fighters and advocates trying to make a difference. And so we thought they would be the perfect voices to bring what Tom's saying down to our local level. I don't know if either one of you have open comments, or you want to just jump into the questions? Based on what you heard from Tom. It wasn't on, based on what you heard Tom said already, I want to give you a minute or so if you have a comment you want to reflect on his statements. Otherwise, I'll just dive in.
I think for me, just the thing to highlight again is the way that this entire topic has been framed and taking politics out of it is that the problem is the behavior of the people. And that's such a fallacy. And because of Tom's work and some of the other work that we do, and we're making connections with real people on the ground, and we know that that's not the truth. And so with that in mind, what are we doing as individuals, as people, as institutions, as organizations to debunk that myth? And how do we go about our lives personally and professionally doing that? I think it's important to keep in mind.
Well said.
The only thing I'd add is that that said, it's a little frustrating that we still have to have that conversation, that we still have to prove with data that these discriminations, that privilege is a thing. Like, why can't we get to the real problem of trying to solve for it versus trying to first prove that it exists, and then have a conversation? Because too often we get lost in the proving and we never get to solutions.
So,
So clearly we got the wrong people for the panel. I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. So,
but
go ahead, Tom.
thank you. I want to underscore that, I just want to underscore that. So, since a lot of us in the room are service deliverers, let's think about what we have to do. When we think we have a great idea that we think is proven, we have to launch a national demonstration project. Random, double-blind experiments. Let's get the data for 10 years. Then we'll bring it to somebody who may or may not fund it, right? That's the level of proof the vulnerable and the opposition have to show, all right? Tell you what I want. I want a 10-year randomized double-blind experiment to see if tax cuts for the wealthy are going to work. And I know who I want in which control group. My point is that when those that have the power to affect policy and the conversation hold us to one set of standards that's almost unreachable, the other set of standards don't exist. Well, that's common sense, you know? And that's the world we operate in.
Okay, great. So Avani and Eric, talk about, there's the image and the reality of Silicon Valley. Talk about that difference in context of what you heard today. And then go ahead and weave in there the concept of how we moved from the image to the reality if we're not comfortable having this conversation about inequities, systemic inequities and racism. You want to start?
Oh, gosh. That's a loaded question. And I say that because it should be one way, and it's not, and we know this. And the whole world watches what's happening in Silicon Valley. And a lot of the buzzwords that we hear in terms of entrepreneurs and investors and this and that, and there's pockets all over the Bay Area that suffer so gravely and so deeply. And that's part of the reality too. That's a big part of the reality. And the way that resources are either hoarded in some communities, in many communities, and we're not willing to talk about those things openly. Even in the very specific example of water in East Palo Alto, and how that continues to be written about in the paper, but what's actually happening when communities all around East Palo Alto have a surplus of water. And so when we talk about resource hoarding, sure, it plays out in the schools, and it also plays out in these fundamental issues that families still don't have access to internet services, but there are things happening worldwide to get people in pockets of the world access to the internet. So I think that Silicon Valley as a stage of what's happening in terms of entrepreneurship and kind of you can do anything here, but you can do anything here if you take a risk but have mom and dad to fall back on. You can do anything here if you have access to this wealth that Tom talked about. You can't do anything here if you don't have those access, if you don't have that access and don't have those resources. And I think that is a reality that we don't often paint.
Barry?
I think that these super kind of complex sets of issues, for me, boil down to two really fundamental things. One is privilege, the other is discrimination. If you have access and opportunity, yeah, sure, great things can happen. If you're facing the consistent headwind of discrimination, right, you're going to be challenged. And so what's, again, is a little frustrating about the narrative and discourse around this, particularly in the Valley, because imagery and narrative are really powerful. And so when you lift up the individual who perhaps has worked hard, not discounting that, has attained both the education and the opportunity to create something amazing and world-changing and therefore makes them wealthy, fantastic. Rarely is the curtain drawn back to here was the foundation that they had to do that. Here were the supports that were there to kick in, right, when trouble came. They didn't live by some folks will know this term and some folks won't. They didn't live by the care package because they didn't need to. Right? They didn't have to work as hard. And then the other part of the narrative is when there's those who want to say, but really, fundamentally, all this is about is just working hard. This is America, land of the free, home of the brave. Everybody that works hard. And so they lift up, as they did, and I say this lovingly because I don't know if folks saw the Atlantic article about San Jose, and one of the individuals highlighted is actually a friend of mine, Tree Tran. He and his wife Maria are friends of ours. And Tree himself is quoted as, coming to America where you can work hard and do well. Well, again, when you pull the curtain back, you quickly come to appreciate, that the imagery that folks want to create in lifting Tree up was a way of saying, if you're just like Tree, if you do what he does, and he started really at the bottom rung, then everybody can, right? And so it was unfortunate, my perspective, and Trey and I have had this conversation. And so the dichotomy of those pictures, right, that exacerbates this whole challenge of how do we support families who, in fact, don't have privilege, families who, in fact, don't have access and opportunity. And so it is so pronounced in the Valley, but it's just it's just the current discourse. The same was true in San Francisco for a moment. The same was true in Chicago for a moment. The same, right? And so these dichotomies that get created over time that paint, or offer a false narrative that it's just about hard work.
That's hard work. Can you let's stay with you, Eric. Go specific into your work. Are there some examples you can relate to the audience about where privilege, advantage, disadvantages has played out and how United Way, in your case, have tried to overcome them? Or
so if I may, let me start one personal and then I'll come to the work. So I'm only child, single mom, public housing in San Francisco. I'm 14 years old, finally get a chance to actually work. The mayor's youth work program, get to help my mom, all good. I'm 3 weeks into it, and I get a call from the office, need you to come into the office. And I'm thinking it's just to check in, whatever. I get into the office and they say, sorry, you can't work anymore. What do you mean I can't work anymore? Your mom makes too much money. Excuse me, but what the? My mother? Right? I literally walked home crying, trying to decide, is my mother hiding money from me? Right? Because I know where we live. I see what we drive or don't drive. I know our challenge of keeping food on the table. This makes no sense to me. And so those systemic challenges are still true today. When we are working with our families at our Spark Point centers in Redwood City at Taft Elementary or at Kenyatta College or at Skyline College, and we're trying to support them to navigate kind of the benefits world of support that are supposed to help them, when we run into things like the benefits cliff, where, again, you get just a little too much in your pocket, then you start to lose resources. You get just a little bit of head, right? Well, again, when the system is not designed to actually help you thrive, well, then that's what, so the system is actually successful. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Create space and opportunity for those with and hold back those that don't have.
Can I just add a couple
Please.
local examples too? So Tom's book talks about school, and I'm an educator by training and have just entered the field of philanthropy, and partially it was because the rage I had with the system and keeping it as it is. So I want you guys to imagine, so I was an 8th grade teacher, and I had a students in my class, right, took algebra, passed the California kind of mark to say that you were proficient at the time or advanced, had an A in my class. We know that grades can be subjective. Okay, same kind of profile of a student. Also scored proficient on the algebra state test, but 10 points lower than my student. Also got an A, actually an A- in his class, and they both went to a public high school here on the peninsula. My student was placed in algebra readiness when we know the data is clear that the more times a student takes algebra, the more likely they are to fail it because of disengagement. Heck, I wouldn't want to take algebra again. The other student, okay, was placed in geometry. Okay, so not only was my student not replaced in algebra, but actually bumped down. You can imagine the race of my student and the race of this other student. Same high school, same kind of objective process that a lawyers committee did a whole report on, said you have to use this system. And what went wrong when I asked is, oh, well, we didn't feel like he had the soft skills he needed during his summer programming to push him up to geometry. It is not that person's right to make that judgment about a life course of an individual, because automatically in that freshman placement, he was derailed. The other example, again, a public high school here on the peninsula. Okay, one of my former students, unfortunately, overdosed on drugs at school. The police was called. 2 months earlier, one of his classmates overdosed on drugs. The ambulance was called. The manner in which we treat similarly situated students, children, and our response to that literally shapes life or death in some cases. So keep that in mind as we say that these stories are powerful, but what are we doing as individuals in those situations? So when I hear about that, do I keep that to myself or do I share that? Do I call out the individuals in that process that made that decision? Right? It's those kinds of things. We can have these objective measures set up and even have this, like, you have to place students in this way. But it's the system, but what makes up the system? People do. And so we have to hold each other accountable even when it's uncomfortable.
May I, just
Please.
briefly? Yes.
Thank you.
Part of what makes this a difficult conversation, I would observe, is that I agree 100+ % that we have to hold folks accountable. And yet we quickly draw back because in holding folks accountable, there is laying at their feet, right? Some accountability for their behavior, and then we get all uncomfortable, understandably. Earlier, Rick said, well, these people aren't evil, are they? The judge in North Carolina said that in terms of voter suppression, he said, the reason this is so clear is that you acted with precision in drawing the lines so as to disadvantage the African American population in this community. Now, I'm not going to declare that those folks were evil, but I'm not going to declare they were good people. That they were well-meaning and well-intentioned, and they just oops with precision. That wasn't oops with precision. And when you go all the way back to what Tom has already talked about, this country was built on that kind of precision. There was and continues to be intentionality around disadvantaging those who are already disadvantaged. And so we've got to collectively get to the place of being willing to have that kind of, if you want to call it name-calling conversation. I think we got to figure out how to do that. Because until we do, then again, it becomes who acts right, again, becomes a behavioral conversation versus this is a system built to, again, advantage and disadvantage folks.
That's exactly right. So as you look out at the room, you guys are giving great information. Where do we focus? Where do we focus our energy? As foundations, as nonprofit leaders, what would you have us do from your perspectives? How do we get to the point that Tom was talking about? We know there's systemic issues, there's institutional issues, there's good and bad people out there. We're also in the game at some point. We can't ignore our role in this. So what do we do to keep allowing the families and individuals we care about to progress?
There's a lot that we need to do, right? We should be in a better place by now, but I think that there is this divide that I see, particularly in my field of grant making, of kind of our professional lives and our personal lives, right? And I was talking to Eric about this before, and when you are a justice advocate to your core, you don't have the luxury of separating that out, right? It ticks in you every single day of your life. And you have these conversations with your families, your coworkers, people that you love and care constantly. And so I think for me, it's how do I, in the work that I do, show up in a way that matters when, for example, matters back to the days that I was a classroom teacher in East Palo Alto, right? Like, what I'm doing today, does that matter? Does that impact the care and love that I had for my students a decade plus ago? And if it's not, then I'm not doing my life's job. I'm not doing my life's work. I think it also comes down to thinking about my family and my home and the way that I grew up. I was extremely privileged growing up, and I need to understand that, unpack that, share that, let it be known. And I need to go back to my family that lives in the Bay Area, that has come from India, that are all in all these sorts of things and are concerned about the suicides in Palo Alto because they shake you and rock you to their core, but don't know about the murders that happen in other places. And these are, again, our children that are dying, maybe for different reasons, sometimes maybe the same reasons, mental issues, right? And so we have to be willing to have those personal conversations and figure out how they bridge your personal and professional life. I also think that there's a lot that's happening in systems, in city councils, in school districts. And as grant makers, we typically talk to traditional leaders, the elected officials, the nonprofit leaders, the school principals. Are we talking to the students, the families, the people that reside in those communities? What is life like there? What is it like, to be a student that is going to the Boys and Girls Club? What is it like to be a teacher that is partnered with the New Teacher Center? We have to be willing to go out and make those relationships and make more informed decisions. A lot of the teachers and leaders in communities like Redwood City and East Palo Alto, they don't live in those communities. And so while I admire them for the work they do, their reality is probably a little bit different than a mother in East Palo Alto. And so what are we doing about that gap, that knowledge gap that exists? So I think that those are some ways to kind of push our thinking in terms of how do we, those that have power and privilege, how are we making those decisions based on people's lives and not just the numbers? Because a lot of people, we don't read the reports that we ask of people. We know this. And so if we spent that time instead connecting with community on a personal, professional level, I think we would get to some of these solutions a lot faster.
Well said. Eric?
So on the philanthropy side, Northern California Grantmakers at their annual meeting a couple of months ago, really focused, I think, importantly, on the need for philanthropy to get out of its safe space of sprinkling stuff into community and seeing if it works or doesn't work. And I live in philanthropy, so I love us, and we still are a little just too conservative in our approach to fighting some of the issues, right, that we're trying to address through our philanthropy. So just a need to become far more bold, far more aggressive, and willingness to fail, right? Let's learn from the valley. Let's fail fast forward and keep moving. Let's try some things, test some things, and push the envelope on things that we haven't typically been willing to do. And I'm saying this broad generalization, but excuse me, but a willingness to move into the advocacy space more boldly, the need to challenge systems in ways that I think philanthropy can collectively do if it decided to do so. So that's that side of it. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. And then on the kind of personal and professional side, I think it begins with what we are trying to do today, which is each of us has to summons the courage to have the conversations. They are not easy. I don't discount that reality. Bill Somerville is an amazing advocate for community, but I need to have the courage, if Bill says something that I think is sideways, to say, hey, Bill, do you realize that is, and can we have that conversation? I hope it goes well. It might not go well, but I have to have the courage to at least have the conversation. And too often, we in our personal and professional lives, we have those moments, sometimes on a daily basis. And we do a mental calculation. And too often we go, Bill may not like me, or Bill may, however we talk ourselves out of it. And I'm just suggesting that we all have to individually, and it'll then, I think, bleed or show up in our personal and professional life more often as we test it. And of course, test it in safe places first. Right. And then work your way towards the deep end of the pool.
All right, great. So I'm going to take one last question, and we're going to open it up to you guys and let you guys ask questions. And maybe start with Tom on this one, and then Eric, Avani, if you have an answer as well. Just to close out, what do we know that is best practice, that is available in reversing the current trends of economic mobility, the lack thereof?
So great, tough question. A lot of what I talked about, I don't want to say is a 30,000 foot level, but it has been mostly about national state policy oriented around equity. We should always think about equity, and we should always think about ways of incorporating racial and economic justice into everything we do. And we also need to think about individual, family, community, economic mobility, and to connect those two. So that's what I want to, in the last sort of open-ended spot, that's what I want to focus on a bit with Rick's questions. What do we know that works? Especially in terms of family economic mobility. I'm going to throw out one, in my mind, proven program that's vastly under capacity, and that's family self-sufficiency. Quickly raise your hand. Do you know what family self-sufficiency is? So I know how much to talk about it. All right, it's part of the incentive-disincentive question. If you're receiving any rent subsidy or in public housing, your rent is calibrated to your income. If your income goes up, you pay more rent. And in reality, and or in the minds of people, there's a cliff effect. How much do I really want to put in to get a raise at work? Do I go to night class? I'm going to lose part of the wage increase in paying more rent. So there's a structured policy-bound disincentive. What family self-sufficiency does, and I'll make it simple, it's not quite this simple. Instead of your rent going up, it's escrowed. It's put into an account with your name on it. If you fulfill successfully your goals and end the program in 5 years, every single dime in that account is yours with no limitations. Because in fact, you have earned it by a second job, a third job, skill enhancement. You've earned more money. That's the only way that account can grow. Right. We have had the opportunity to evaluate some of those programs in our area, and I would strongly say that those programs need to be what I would call asset-based programs. It can't just be a local housing administrator talking to you once a year and checking off whether your income is increased or not. There's got to be a wraparound of some financial coaching, other services around that. In those kinds of programs, we had somebody, in the first 3 months of evaluating this program, a woman walked out of Lynn Public Housing with an $18,000 check. Right. Now that's mobility. And she used that to buy a home, to get herself out of public housing in the city of Lynn, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, and became a homeowner. Now that's not the story for every single one, because your income really has to increase a lot for that escrow account to build up to that. We estimate that there are about 5 million people receiving rent subsidies who work, that therefore are eligible for family self-sufficiency. Only about 5% are in the program. And that's because of lack of capacity at the local housing authority level. Proven program, I would suggest, if done right, has the incredible proven capacity to transform the trajectory and arc of a particular family. Right? That's something we could focus on. I don't know what FSS, family self-sufficiency, is like in the peninsula, but maybe it's something we need to learn more about.
Great. Do you guys have any comments before we open it up?
Sure, really quickly. Another I'd add to that category of things that we know that work. One is the earned income tax credit. We know that it works and supports families. We also know that we are grossly under-leveraging that resource and that too many eligible families are not taking advantage of it. We just had a great collective win in Sacramento, where the governor signed and increased the level, both self-employment, which did not count before, as well as increasing from $14,000 now to $22,000 for eligibility for families. We know that that works. Secondly, we know as a practice approach that integrated services for families works. That doesn't mean, all the single-focused organizations don't do what they do. It does mean, though, that we think differently about integrating those services and supports for families, that they advance along a number of different paths for them. We know that that works. And lastly, sorry, this is what he tried to avoid, but rebellion works also. Resistance works. Yeah. There is no benefit that we have in this country. I mean this actually literally now. There's no benefit we have in this country that we didn't gain from fighting for it. Right? So we can't lose that particular leverage or give up that tool.
Yeah, that was the hidden trove of why it took a Union General to implement the Proclamation of Emancipation in the state of Texas.
And I'll just say really quickly, I'll highlight again, I think the impact of community voice, I can't underscore that enough, particularly when it comes to policies and practices. Of course, the number of lives impacted always matters, particularly for grant makers. But if we can think about impact in different ways, particularly as they policies shape out and practices play out, once you engage a community in the right ways and really try and work with them to uplift their voices and bring them to kind of places that hold the power and that hold the privilege, I think you can get impact faster for entire peoples than these individual lives.
Great, thank you. Stand up, say your name, and say who you are. That would be helpful as well when you get the microphone as well.
Rick,
So
can I
that would be
just
helpful.
suggest we go to her down there first because she had her
Yes,
hand
because
up
you wanted earlier.
a
So
long time ago.
if you can follow all those rules, we'll get as many questions as we can. Just on.
Okay. Ruslana Yaroslavsky, Redwood City Library Foundation. Thank you for amazing stats. Really appreciate it. Wonderful stats about whites and blacks and Hispanics. What's happening with Asians?
Okay, great question.
Thank you.
So let me not make this too long. It's not out of neglect or intentionality. Most of the national databases don't have a samples large enough of Asian American, Pacific Islanders, indigenous peoples, so it's been hard to get at. However, there is one, and we're starting to get it at the national level now. There is one study that's been done in 5 metropolitan areas, done by my colleagues Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton. The acronym is NASC, that specifically samples ethnic and racial minorities within those within the 5 metropolitan areas, and does it in a way that does something very important, because as we get away with a very sloppy conversation here, and that is Asian Americans, Hispanics, that's an umbrella. It's an aggregate of a lot of different historical, cultural legacies, and then we give an average figure. What this study does, it disaggregates. So like in Boston, they sampled Cape Verdeans. They sampled people of Puerto Rican ancestry, of Dominican ancestry, native-born African Americans, and were able to look at the data somewhat like that. In Los Angeles, they looked at Vietnamese, Laotians, and some others. Tulsa, they looked at indigenous peoples. So my point is, it's hard to get the data. We're starting to get it. Roundly, after I've given all the yellow flag cautions, the Asian American data is much closer at the average level to whites, but that hides so much.
Right.
There's so much heterogeneity operating within there, of somebody, a relatively wealthy family from Taiwan whose sons and daughters have immigrated, is combined with the same group as people who've come, refugees from the boat from Laos. So that's the caution. Sorry.
Good.
Yes, in that study they did. It's hard to get data in national surveys about nativity, about where people were born and how long they've been here, but it's a critical factor.
Other question?
Hi, Suzanne St. John Crane with American Leadership Forum. I've witnessed in conversations in our fellows program where you've got an imam next to a congressperson, next to African American person, the role of real authentic dialogue and where a white ally kind of fits into this conversation. I'm just curious if you have, if you've seen that come up more recently with what's going on nationally. Just what can a white ally? How do we create a culture of folks that are allies in this issue?
Why do I think this is at me? So this is what's a white Jewish boy from Beverly Hills doing talking about the racial wealth question, which is true.
We've had that conversation over dinner many times. Right.
Yes. I think there are many different roles that get played out here. At one level, I understand some of the role that I personally play when I'm asked, for example, to come and talk, which I am, to historically black colleges. And the role I'm playing there is, it's important for their conversation to show that there are white people involved, that it's not just a black issue, a brown issue, whatever issue. So messaging that is important. I also think in the writing I do, and by the way, for those of you that are interested, there are about 25 copies of Toxic Inequality available for purchase, and I'm going to sit out there and sign stuff. And I'll say, Susan, without your input, this book would not have been possible. Thank you. One of the main audiences for that book, I think, is the white community. It's one of the main audiences. I think there are others. Most of the feedback I've been getting so far has been from colleagues and organizations of color about how they feel that the book has been very useful. And the book is a proxy for getting me here today. It's the platform that allows me to do some of that. So I think there are a lot of roles, and I would emphasize the plural that can and should be played there, that signal to different kinds of communities. And we had when we were talking about this conversation among ourselves, somebody raised, I forget who it was, how can we model this conversation? And my thought is, well, you don't talk about it, you do it. And I think that we're doing it.
And we're doing it. Great.
Can I have one quick thing really
sure.
quickly? And that is, how many have seen the movie Get Out? Get Out? So for those that haven't, just a small, quick scene. Young white woman is taking her African-American boyfriend home to meet the family. They get pulled over by the cops. Right? She's driving. He's sitting in the passenger seat. Roll down the window. The cop says, not to her, but to him, let me see your ID. In that moment, she had choice how she would use her privilege. Mm-hmm. She said, no, what do you mean? I'm driving, right? And that was the whole scene. My point is, it really fundamentally, I think it's about the privileged being willing to put their privilege on the line on behalf of. And that shows up personally, it shows up professionally, it shows up in our lives almost on a daily basis. And I think that'll go a long way.
Great. Good. Go ahead. Good?
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll come on.
Oh, we got two.
Hang on, I'm going back and forth.
one,
So
two.
your turn. Yeah.
Oh, are we canning?
Yes. Go for
Yes,
it.
sir.
I'm Neelu Jenks with Healthy Cities Tutoring. And I was listening, and you said that the ones in power hold us to impossible standards, referencing the double-blind 10-year studies. And recently, I've just been looking at how much politicians are paid. Local politicians get almost nothing. There's a lot of volunteer positions that end up putting a lot of older white men, in positions of power.
Wait a minute. Are you accusing me of being old?
I don't know.
Well, that was the white man part. But I think that creates an inherent problem because not everybody has access to those positions, and they are the people making the policies. And I think that's why the structural, racism can continue to go on. I don't think they're necessarily inherently evil, but they don't know everything. And how do we get other people into those positions? And is it by creating pay for politicians or volunteer commissions or whatever?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does somebody want to?
Well, I was actually going to say this is exactly how your point comes to fruition, is that you find the allies that are willing to get meetings with these people that have the power to then figure out, okay, now that I have your ear, can I bring, a family that really struggles with this issue? And then that grows wider and wider. We did it here through the Sequoia Union High School District, right? We fundamentally changed the boundaries, and it wasn't, my students and families felt it for so long, but because they're black and brown, their voices weren't valued as much. Because I was a teacher in Ravenswood City School District, I also wasn't taken very seriously. I had to go get my doctorate. I had to summon a lawyers committee. I had to figure out how I could get the Atherton volunteers that are mothers, that are friends of the school board members, to get them to get a meeting with me. And through this coalition building, then we were able to kind of change policy. But this is where the privilege and the allies show up in incredible ways. It has to be calculated, and you have to be patient. And I've tripped and failed along the way because we just work with this impatience. But I think that those are ways where people can really step out of their comfort zone and take meetings.
Thank you.
And I would only quickly say that to the fundamental part of your question, yes, we do need to figure out how we get, I'll call them common everyday folk, and the folks who are most impacted by the policies into policy roles. The system at every level is create,
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm one of those elected people in San Mateo County. I'm director of the fire district in Menlo Park, which includes Atherton, East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and the southern part of San Mateo County. When you were talking about water, remember, in East Palo Alto, well, unfortunately, because of privilege that we had talked about, there are 6 separate water districts in our fire district. So we have to deal with 6 separate water districts that buy their water from the same place, okay? So what us local people have done, which some of our federal counterparts have not been able to do, is work in a teamwork concept where if you saw East Palo Alto got the additional water that they needed relative to some of their development, which also impacts our fire district, because what we have is what they call an ISO, which is the insurance rating for the entire district, which includes all the communities.
Okay, you have to ask a question because we got a lot of people.
No, I just wanted to
Clarify.
to point to her when she's saying
Yeah,
that.
is there a question though?
Yeah, I
Okay.
just want to know how additionally can we help relative to coordinate
Perfect.
the same types of efforts
Thank you. Perfect.
as elected people, other than what's been going on presently.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Well, I'm not so plugged into how the local politics plays out, and that's on me, and that's a learning that I need to be more involved in. But I would just say, I mean, again, like how are officials, instead of just like the individual stories that they're hearing, are there kind of community forums that are being hosted and feedback is given? What do you do with that feedback then? Are we looping back with the communities that provided that feedback? Are we saying we are moving forward with this and this is why? We're not moving forward with this and this is why? I think that there's lots of forums and discussions that happen, but then what happens after is very rarely shared. And so I guess my point is to come together and make sure that the community is involved in the processes.
Great.
Hi, I'm Kyra Brown. I work with Youth United for Community Action in East Palo Alto, and my question is, how does the reality of gentrification, which also leads to economic displacement, impact the concept of toxic inequality as well as the solutions that we discuss here today? Thank you.
Great. Who wants to take that?
Well,
Eric?
about, I want to say 4 years ago, Brookings Institute, in one of their blogs, did a piece where they looked at communities across the country, traditionally concentrated centers of poverty, and they looked at them over 10 years, 10-year periods of time. And in looking at them, and then revisiting them 10 years, they wanted to see what had changed. Had there been any demonstrable, significant improvement in their conditions? And what they concluded from at least the communities they studied was that those that had no gentrification had little to no demonstrable change. Those that had some gentrification had some demonstrable change. And I found it fascinating because, again, I start where you started, kind of the negative impact of gentrification. And it caused me to begin to at least widen my own lens to consideration around what's needed in a community around economic engine and economic development that helps it climb out of that space. So I don't know the answer, except that I don't believe now the answer is stop gentrification, like kind of blanket. But how do you do it smart if there's such a thing?
Mm-hmm. So I would just add to that. I think the national conversation around gentrification has been boxed into a binary, and we need to unbox that because in my sense of values, I want communities to improve. I want infrastructure to improve. I want schools to be better. I want there to be local businesses. I want there to be entrepreneurship. I want there to be housing security. I want abandoned homes boarded up. I want affordable housing. But I want that to be done in a way that the people who live there over a period of time get to stay there and become part of that process. And the way we do that is through community organizing that grabs a hold of zoning issues, grabs a hold of housing issues, grabs a hold of those economic development issues. And you don't want to be in a community, for example, that is, quote, rising because there is $100 billion worth of construction going on, and 98% of that is very, very high-end condos, right?
Great.
All right,
Yes,
my
sir.
name is Jeremiah Sims. I'm the Director of Equity for the College of San Mateo. And I had a question, but before I get to the question, I want to address a question that came out briefly.
Three periods.
Okay, so this may be fairly provocative for some of you, but in reality, there is no allyship with whiteness for people of color, because whiteness is a system that's predicated on white supremacy, wherein whiteness is the thesis and anything other than whiteness is antithetical to that. So before there can be any real allyship with people who identify as white, they have to first repudiate that whiteness and understand that the systematicity of that whiteness is intrinsically toxic. And then so my question is about framing. And so I was looking at this title, and I wanted to check it out primarily because of the title. Because the title suggests with the modifier there that there is some type of inequity that is not intrinsically toxic, right? And we know that not to be the case. And so my question then is, how do we frame this conversation so that we're able to have authentic, generative conversations that move all of us forward? Because we can't do things for people and expect that to be sustainable. We have to do it alongside people. And so, again, the issue for me is not just the title, right? But that's representative of what I'm trying to get at, because the way that we think about these things, and this is my last period, the way that we think about these things, they're value-laden, right? There's a deserved poor and an undeserved poor, right? And so these are the problems that we run into in places like East Palo Alto, where I'm from. I'm from Richmond, California. And so my question is, how can we frame these conversations in a way that's more succinct and not disingenuous, so that we can create entry points for all different types of people to enter into the conversation, so that we can do the work necessary for the betterment of our entire planet?
Great, thank you.
So great, thank you, seriously. Let me take up the second part of it at this moment. The title, Toxic Inequality, comes out of some really hard work around meta-narrative that was done in consultation, very close working consultation with a group of about a dozen people, whose names I'm not going to mention, but at least 10 of which would be immediately known as our beacons around racial justice in the United States. And for me, and I'm the one that's proposing obviously it's the title of the book. It's Toxic Inequality to primarily make a huge distinction of where we are right now in the United States with the inequality that has always existed, and even when we do better, shut off the Twitter stuff, always will exist. Inequality is not the issue. The issue is about justice, racial justice, economic justice, and my attempt now to delineate how different we are. Historic highs of both wealth and the racial wealth gap and income inequality in the United States, a racial wealth gap that's growing. Stalled mobility and living standards for families. Demographic change in a way that, if Trump doesn't interfere too much, by about 2042 or so, there'll be no one racial or ethnic group that's a numerical majority in the United States. Familiar in the state of California, but not elsewhere in the nation. Severe, great implications for us to deal with our institutions and our politics and our values around that. A robust and exaggerated racial anxiety and fears of immigrants, not just this last electoral cycle, but have been with us for a long time. To me, those are the ingredients of a very bad mixture that distinguish where we are in the United States today, that I think takes a lot of transformative policy reform and visionary opposition to get over. So that, for me, that's where the title comes from. It's taking sort of those elements, trying to weave them together in a way that basically puts, the increasing wealth and income, historic highs in inequality with the racial wealth gap and racial injustice, and to bring those conversations together.
Great, thanks. So, Mike over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mauricio Cordova, a family, Loaves and Fishes Family Kitchen, talking about the part of policy. And you mentioned Trump right now, which kind of brings to this question. What are we doing, or what do you guys suggest as leaders? Bring more young leaders that want to get involved in policy, because that's a lot of big equality. You look at how Congress is set up right now. Well, we know minorities are very small there. And to bring this kind of message through, what do you suggest we do, or how do we inspire more diverse individuals to become part of this policy remake, shift of the Congresses, the Senates, and so forth, to change the mentality of what we see right now? And unfortunately with you, what we saw the last 8 years, some of the social changes that we're moving forward now look like they're being erased, one signature at a time. So what do you suggest on that?
Mm-hmm. So,
Well, my
yep.
step out the road for a minute, and I think Avani as well. I think the number one answer is they need to see more of us in positions like this. I spent a lot of my time going to schools. We need to create a pipeline. So not only do they need to see us, we need to then show them how. And I think there are a lot of folks eager to jump into the fray. But right now, it is, borrowing the term, the conversation is toxic. And they don't see that they can make a point. They can achieve the goals they want to achieve. So I think we need to, as the broader we, need to show that we can have conversation. That's why I framed it about values. When you talk to young folks, they don't understand why it is not okay for you to take care of people, elderly people in the community. They don't understand why this is a fight, that we're having these kind of fights over these issues. And so they don't want to play in that. That's what they tell me. They may tell other folks different things. So I think it's the modeling that we put out there. It's how we tell the stories, how we, as Avani said, it's how we bring our authentic self to the game and have those conversations. But it's going to take a generation or so, in my mind, to make that shift. But I think there's people coming. I think we're going to be surprised. There are a lot of people coming up. I think they're energized, and they'll take the mantles from folks like us and run with it. Mm-hmm. We need to build a space for them to do that, and make some difference.
Yeah, I think in addition, the pipeline issues I think are really critical, and that's a space where philanthropy can really be helpful. There's a lot of value add that can be put into place there, with some pretty strong values. I would also suggest and challenge all of us. I know when it's with me and my organization, and when we work in coalitions and initiatives and alliances, we try to be very attuned to the mantra, nothing about us without us. And it needs to be in the voice of those we're concerned about as well. It's incredibly paternalistic, patriarchal, et cetera, to start an initiative, a program, for the so-called benefit of a particular group if they're not there.
Okay. And I think there's there's lots of hands going up. All right. So I'm going back and forth. Is this, Raina, this? Okay, you gentlemen, and then it'll be your turn. Go ahead.
Hi, Joe Hardy.
You got to stand up.
Oh, darn it.
Announcers. Great.
I'm just glad I'm not the last question. Joe Hardy with the Opportunity Youth Partnership in Santa Clara County. My question is kind of, I think it's pretty simple. Why don't we just give the money to the people? I think the program you mentioned, the family self-sufficiency and the earned income tax credits are federal mechanisms to move money to families to top up income or top off income. And I'm wondering, with 3 philanthropists on the panel, is there a way that we could explore philanthropy? We've built up a pretty big artifice, a pretty big structure of nonprofit institutions, and really professionalized the social service sector. But is there an opportunity for philanthropy locally to explore moving money directly to families and individuals in need?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll go first so I'm not last. I think, yes, absolutely worth exploring. I think whether it's philanthropic dollars or, frankly, federal or state or even local resources, a challenge and where that kind of meets opposition is that the structures that create the opportunity to do that are the same structures that have perpetuated the inability to do that, right? And so it's not as simple as a decision to do so. Right. It is, we've got to change the structural dynamics and systems and policies that make that possible. Because on the federal side, you can't start giving individuals. There's certain elements of philanthropy where as much as I'd love to give you a scholarship to do X or Y, I can't because of these parameters. So again, there are just structural dynamics that don't make it a straight line.
And I think it's also the willingness of is that what we actually want?
Right.
I know it's a difficult question to ask and hear, but when we talk about values, do we actually value diversity? Do we actually value a different kind of system altogether, right? Because the system right now, it is working, and do we want to fundamentally kind of rebel and reconstruct that with a value of the new system being diversity? I'm not sure that the people with power and privilege want that. And that is when the conversation gets difficult. When we did some policy work on the Peninsula for schools, the school board members were saying, this is an issue of overpopulation. They weren't willing to say it was a matter of equity. It took 2.5 years to get public school board members to say that it's a matter of equity, not an overpopulation issue, right? So I think that we have to keep the end in mind is like, do we actually value diversity? Do we actually believe that the system is working and it is structured in a way to work and keep people down? Those are the difficult conversations to have.
And then I think you had the benefit of our last question.
Raina Lehman with the Union Community Alliance. Raina Lehman with the Union Community Alliance. And I'm feeling this is a great conversation, but I am certainly feeling all the many layers of division that we are being faced with locally and nationally today. It's really painful. And I mean, our challenge is to find the way to lift all folks, to create the policies. I think talking about the policy conversation and the advocacy conversation, which nonprofits have had our hands sort of tied for so many years for entering into, is kind of the way that we have to go. The policies, universal health care, the policies of increasing the minimum wage, the policies of creating retirement accounts to start to address some of the differences that everyone who's working, we're all working hard, but not everyone is benefiting in the same ways. So I think the question is, how do we take the conversation and how do we really translate it into advocacy and into creating the kind of policies that we want to see? In the face of the challenge that you just mentioned, not everybody looks at it the same way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go first this time, so I don't have to go last. But I came from the education field, and I entered the field of philanthropy, and it wasn't an easy transition. A Bay Area native, I thought that this place was valued diversity all the way around. We choose to live here because we value diversity. Then I switched fields, and thunk. I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure that all of the Bay Area values diversity. And so some of my assumptions about the philanthropic sector have been challenged in a positive way and sometimes not in a positive way. And so what are we, again, in positions of power and privilege, as staff at foundations and organizations, what are we willing to say and not say in board meetings? Of course, there's a certain protection that we give to our board, but our board actually wants to learn. And what role do we play in educating them? How do we bring this impatience to them in a way that makes sense for them, right? And that's a juggle that all of us do. And I think it's important, again, to be real and not just be protectors, but at staff, again, with power and privilege, it is our duty to educate our boards in a way that they may not have access to. I don't know too much about policy. I don't know too much about real estate. I know about education to the core. And what can I do to bring up these issues of education in a race and equity kind of way? Because that's the reality that's playing out in the Bay Area.
And I think one, Raina, we have to, try to be simplistic, but grow the chorus of folks who are trumpeting the same issue of inclusion and diversity, and that as a core value, right, to all that we do, not an add-on, not an additional thing we do to check a box. And then I would agree. I mean, in our boardroom, Raina, you know our boardroom. I am advocating for the kind of abolishment of predatory payday lending with my board members who are EVPs at banks. But that's the conversation, right, that we have to have. Again, I think it's seizing the opportunities, and we all have them both personally and professionally. These are, Eric's opinion, these are dinner time conversations, these are social conversations, these are professional conversations. We are all in positions and have opportunities to further this discussion so that it's not one-offs and they're not disparate, but that there's a growing and rising chorus so that when we get to the place of readiness for real policy moves and shifts, the chorus is there to support it.
Great. Thank you both. Tom, do you want a closing comment? You're good?
I think maybe a good last comment for me would be it's a great question. And for me, what it presumes is the ability and capacity for a community, or at least enough parts of that community, to pull itself together and to make a commitment to a long-term campaign initiative around a specific set of issues and or values. And so, for example, from the conversation today, one could maybe pull out housing, one could pull out education, one could pull out the racial wealth gap, and from one of those conversations, start a deeper dive that gets us to an understanding of what's going on in this area, what are the points of transformation that are possible, and to dig in and to dive from there, always with, in my view, racial justice at the core of that, whether it's talking about housing or whether it's talking about education. And I'm thinking in my mind, not thinking, I'm recalling in my mind the very robust initiatives going on in Boston right now around closing the racial wealth gap that started with your most unlikely, seemingly the most unlikely ally of all, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, convening a working group where people showed up and did a lot of work, and now is in the mayor's office. The city of Buffalo, that's got a strategic report out. The city of Seattle, that's implemented a racial justice equity filter for government, municipal contracts, and all kinds of things. We don't have to make it up. There's some lessons and some failures we should be learning from, but we need to, that's where we need to start.
Great, thank you all. Why don't you join me in thanking the panel? Yeah.
Eric?
Outstanding. So a couple things before you leave. My mind is spinning right now. There's a lot of stuff I could say and won't say and should say and will say next time. It's clear that we probably need to do this again. There was a lot of people that didn't get called on, and I apologize for that. It's just a function of time. Remember how we started this. We wanted to have this conversation because we need to have an understanding deep within our bones about our day-to-day work and how that is running up into or alignment with stuff that is affecting people's lives on a daily basis. Is our strategies, in our case, producing opportunities through education and careers, is that getting at the institutional issues, the institutional racism, the structural barriers that are affecting families, particularly families of colors and communities that we care about? We need to look at that. And we can't look at that in isolation. And we can't look at that without conversations with all of you. And we can't look at that without, as has been said today, looking at ourselves in the mirror as well. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of conversations we need to have. I'm from the standpoint that there is welcome room for allies. And I think we need everybody. There's not a civil rights legislation. There's nothing that has not been passed with folks inside or outside, and folks of all hue making that happen. So in my sense, the room and the tent cannot be big enough, and we all need to be a part of it. So I cannot thank you enough for being here and starting this. There's a lot of anxiety about how this was going to go. I think it went as well as it could for the first time, and we'll figure out a way to do it again. A couple other tidbits before you leave. We have some books that so people that were able to ask questions got a little tag that they can get a free book. We have a couple free books. When you turn in your name tags until they run out, if you want some of the extra ones, you can get those. After they run out, because we don't have a lot of them, I know Tom is signing some that he's selling out by the audience. So that's announcement one. Number two is that if you haven't been here before, part of our agenda and part of our social mission is social enterprise. And so we have Job Train runs a social enterprise cafe next door, and they have provided the lunch. So everyone has lunch. You can stay in here. It's nice and air conditioned. You don't want to go outside anyway. So you can eat in here. You can eat in the rooms. You can eat in the cafe and enjoy the AC before you head back to your various locations. Georgia, thank you very, very much for doing this. And thank all my staff, who I can't do. I get to sit up here, but all the work is done by them. So if you haven't met them, please do. All right, thank you all. Guys, thank you. That was